Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we're going to be trying out a new recipe together. I'm going to be trying blueberry scones. Now I have made a very similar recipe by the same recipe author before, cranberry orange scones, which are delicious, and I think these scones are pretty much the same except they have blueberries instead of cranberries and orange. So I anticipate that these will be delicious as well. We're just going to test out this recipe together and I'll let you know how it comes out and what I think of it. So let's come on over to the counter and let's get started. Now we do not need a stand mixer for this recipe, we just need a bowl. We're going to start with all-purpose flour, that's our first ingredient. So we're going to put 2 cups of that into this bowl here. Now I'm going to link the recipe in the video description so that you don't have to worry about writing this down as we make this together and try this out. So if you decide that this recipe looks good and it's something that you want to try, just follow the link in my video description. All right, so we've got our 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Now we're going to add half a cup of granulated sugar. Next, we're going to add 2½ teaspoons of baking powder. I've got a ½ teaspoon measurer here, so we're going to put 5 of these in to equal 2½ teaspoons. Now we're going to add ½ a teaspoon of salt. I have kosher salt here, but any salt that you have would work well. And we're going to put a teaspoon of cinnamon. So I will say this definitely has all the makings of a good recipe already. So now we're just going to go ahead and whisk this together. So if you don't have a stand mixer, I know a lot of the recipes that I make use stand mixers, which isn't strictly necessary, but it does make your job easier a lot of times. But this is a great one that doesn't require a stand mixer. All it is a little bit of elbow grease. So we've got our dry ingredients all whisked together. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run to my freezer and I am going to grab some butter. So for this recipe, it's really important to use frozen butter. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that we want our scone dough to stay as cold as possible. We want it to be completely chilled until the moment that they actually go into the oven. That's going to prevent them from overspreading and give them that good flaky scone texture that you want without being dense. The other reason that we want frozen butter is because we're going to be grating it, and I've never tried to grate butter that is not frozen, but I imagine it's probably not very easy. So grating frozen butter is the way to go. That is going to break up our butter into tiny little pieces and allow it to incorporate evenly through our dough. Now, when you have a recipe that you want to be really flaky, like scones or pie crust, something that you want to be flaky and have a lot of little pockets in it, you want to use cold butter because what's going to happen is your butter is not going to fully incorporate with the other ingredients. There's going to be little flecks of butter throughout your ingredients. And then when you put that product into the oven, the butter is going to basically melt and evaporate, and the steam from the butter is going to create those little flaky pockets. So that's why we don't want to use softened butter. Softened butter would become completely incorporated with the other ingredients and not give us those little pockets of flakiness that we want. So we are going to need ½ a cup of butter, which is the same as 1 stick of butter. This is a block here, but this is the equivalent of 2 sticks. So I'm going to cut this in half and grate half of it up. And this butter is my all-time favorite butter. Look at how rich and yellow that is. It's organic grass-fed butter. I get this, oh, it takes a little bit of strength to cut into frozen butter. I get this from Azure Standard. If you've seen any of my Azure haul videos, you know how much I love this butter. So I'm going to stick the rest of this block back in my refrigerator, and we're going to come grate the rest of our frozen butter. Now I've got a couple little flakes here that just kind of came off the end, so I'm just going to chop those up as finely as I can and then throw those in our dough. But for the rest of this, we're going to get it grated. Now, as always when you're grating anything, you want to be careful not to grate your hands. I have done that many, many times, and it's never a fun experience. So just keep an eye when you're I try not to grate too fast because that's when you tend to grate your hands. All right, so we've got our butter all grated, and aren't these curls of butter beautiful? They just are so pretty, I think. So we're just going to add these into the rest of our ingredients. I'm just going to grab the ones that are on the inside of the grater as well. I'm going to use a spatula rather than my hands because I don't want the heat from my hands to soften the butter any more than it already has. Now, as a random aside, my kids are homeschooled, and they go to a really, really cool homeschool co-op. And basically every semester I teach a different class there. And about a year ago, the class that I taught was called Chemistry in the Kitchen. And we basically did a lot of cooking experiments. It was so much fun. And one of the ingredients that we made was scones. And I split the class into two groups. And half of the class made scones the regular way using the butter, the frozen butter, and grating it. And the other half melted their butter, and we compared the results. They were both delicious. The group that had melted the butter, their scones came out kind of more with like a muffin texture. So they were still really good, but you could really tell the difference between that group with the melted butter and the group that had grated the frozen butter. It was really interesting. So I actually learned a lot teaching that class. So it was a lot of fun for me too. So we have our grated butter all incorporated in here. I'm just going to go ahead and cut through this with a pastry cutter just to break up any clumps of butter that may have kind of stuck together. So we're just going to basically chop this up a little bit, and then I'm going to stick this dough in the fridge while we mix together our wet ingredients. And we'll bring this back out here in a couple minutes when we're ready for it. Grating the butter ahead of time makes this step really quick and easy. All right, I'm gonna get this in the fridge. I'll be right back. So now I've got a small bowl here, and in this we're going to mix together our wet ingredients. So the first thing that we're going to need is one large egg. Now, whenever I am mixing stuff together that calls for an egg, I always put the egg in first if I can, just because you never know when you're going to get a rotten one. Now, this egg was laid fresh by my chickens outside. I think this is about 2 days old. So I'm confident that this egg is fine, but it's just a good habit to get into. If you're mixing and you already have a bunch of ingredients there and you need to add your egg in, I always crack it into a separate little bowl first and then pour it in there, because I think in my entire life I've only had 1 or 2 rotten eggs, but it is not a fun experience, and it's even less fun when you have a whole dish that you've been working on and now you've ruined it by putting a rotten egg in it. So I like to always either put my egg in first or separately. Today we're going with first. So here's the bowl for our wet ingredients. Just gonna crack that egg, put it in there. Cracked it with a little bit of excessive force and broke the yolk right open. To this egg, we are going to add half a tablespoon of vanilla. This is homemade vanilla here. You can see, I wish you could smell this, but these are the biggest, most beautiful beans. I actually need to put some of this into a smaller jar. I normally do keep some in a smaller jar for everyday use, but I ran out and I haven't refilled it yet. So there's our vanilla. All right, now I need to go to the fridge and I need to get some heavy cream. That's our last wet ingredient that we need in here. So we're going to need half a cup of heavy cream. So we're just gonna whisk this cream into our egg and our vanilla. Just wanna grab all the extra cream in here. Now this recipe says to start with half a cup and then add more cream if you need it. I think I've needed more cream every time I've made some variation of the scone recipe, so I anticipate that we're going to need more. But we're gonna start with half a cup. It's a little bit humid today, so maybe it'll be the first time I can get away with only using a half cup. I just got the last little bit that kind of pooled in the bottom there. Okay, so I need to go get the rest of our ingredients out of the refrigerator. I'm also going to get out a cup of frozen blueberries. So we don't want to thaw our blueberries ahead of time for 2 reasons. One, when you thaw them, they tend to get a little more liquidy and runny, and we don't want the blueberry juice to go all throughout the scones. We want it to stay contained in the blueberries. The other reason is that it's going to help keep our scone dough extra cold. In case you haven't noticed by now, the main theme of making scones is keeping the dough as cold as possible until it goes into the refrigerator. So I'm going to grab our dry ingredients and I'm going to grab a cup of blueberries from my freezer, and then we're gonna put everything all together. Okay, so we're going to take our wet ingredients and kind of carefully drizzle them over our dry ingredients. And then we're going to mix our blueberries in here. Now these are fresh picked blueberries from last summer. I figured now that I'm starting to fill up my freezer with blueberries from this summer, I figured I better make sure and use up the ones from last summer. Make a little bit of room. So we're gonna mix this together as well as we can. You can see that it's kind of a crumbly dough. I'm gonna try to get the last little drips that are in the bottom of this. Make sure we get every bit of liquid and also the little cream that we left in the bottom of this. Let's see if that's enough. Scones tend to have kind of a crumbly dough, but we need to make sure it's wet enough that we can actually mix it together. And we can actually get it to stick together into cohesive pastries. So I think we are going to need a little bit more cream. I tried to add as small an amount as possible because we don't want to overdo it, but I'm just going to drizzle in a little bit more cream. And sometimes, this is why you always want to have clean hands when you first start baking. Sometimes I have to go in there and kind of really mix it with my hands a little bit. You want to do this as little as possible because you don't want the heat from your hands to really heat up the dough. But sometimes it's the only way to really get it incorporated. So we're going to try it like this and see, well, you know, let me see if I can get all this stuff from the bottom incorporated in here. I'll tell you, between doing this and grating that butter, this is my workout for the day. And so I can reward myself for my workout with a delicious scone later, right? That's how it works. All right. I think that's about as good as it's going to get. So you can see it's still pretty crumbly, but we are able to press it together into a cohesive unit. So I'm just going to get my workspace cleaned up. I'm going to stick this dough back in the fridge while I do that so that we have a nice clean area to shape our scones. All right, so our workspace is nice and clean. I've got the scone dough out of the fridge. So we're going to put this onto a nice clean countertop and then we're going to shape our scones. So we want to take our dough, just put it out onto our countertop. I'm going to try to get this little last bit of flakiness that wouldn't really incorporate. I'm going to see if I can get it to incorporate now that we have this out. So we want to just kind of shape it together into, it says about an 8-inch disc. I usually just kind of estimate. But we want to work as quickly as we can. Now this dough is pretty stiff. I didn't need to flour my work surface, but if you find that it's sticking to your counter, go ahead and flour it. I'm going to say that's not quite 8 inches. Let me make it a little bit more. Okay, so once you've got it into about an 8-inch round, you're going to go ahead and cut it into 8 wedges. I just kind of cut across like that. So here's our pie of scones. I'm just going to put them on this lined baking sheet here, and I'm going to put them a couple inches apart. Part of the goal of keeping everything cold was to minimize how much they're going to spread in the oven. They are going to spread some, we just don't want them to spread too much. Because they're going to spread a little bit, we do want to keep them separated by a couple inches on the baking sheet. Now, you may have noticed I did not preheat the oven the way I normally would. You know what? I'm gonna do it like this because I think that just makes more sense. So you may have noticed that I didn't preheat the oven the way you normally would when you're starting a baking recipe. That is because these are going to go into the refrigerator once again for another 15 minutes before baking, and I'm going to use that time to get the oven preheated. Now, if you don't have space in your refrigerator for a whole baking sheet, you could certainly just put these all together on a plate, just in the round shape that they were in before. I like to just get them set up so I don't have to mess with them once they've chilled. So here's a last look at our scones before they chill. They look really good. So I'm gonna stick these in the refrigerator for 15 minutes. While they're chilling, I'm going to preheat our oven to 400 degrees. Once these are chilled and the oven is preheated, I'm going to meet you back here and show you the final steps. All right, so our scones have been chilling for 15 minutes. Our oven's all preheated to 400 degrees. So it's time to do the final step and then get these in the oven. So just to make sure that these have a nice crispy top and nice crispy edges, we're going to brush them with a little bit of heavy cream, and then we're going to sprinkle them with a little bit of coarse sugar. I have this turbinado raw cane sugar that I'm going to use, and that just will give them a little bit of an extra special crunch and just make them a little bit extra delicious. So we're just going to go ahead and brush the tops, and I like to brush the sides, basically all of the exposed edges of these scones with this cream. And then we're just going to put a little sprinkle of sugar on each one. Now I really like this sugar here. You can see it's nice brown coarse sugar. Now these scones are ready to bake. The recipe calls for them to bake for between 22 to 26 minutes. I'm going to set the timer for 20 minutes and check on them and see if they need to come out then. So I will meet you back here when they're done and show you what they look like. So these are definitely done. You can see they're nice and golden brown on top. You can see that they've spread a little bit, but they've mostly maintained their shape. They look like they're nice and crispy on the edges. So this was only 20 minutes. So that's why I always like to check my recipes a little bit sooner than the recipe says. So while our scones are cooling for a couple minutes, we are going to make some vanilla icing. And once they've cooled off, we don't have to wait for them to cool completely, but once they've cooled down a little bit, we're going to drizzle some icing on top just to give them that really extra special touch. So this is a really super simple icing recipe. You could use the same recipe for cinnamon rolls or pretty much anything that you just want a little bit extra sweetness and a little extra, just something special on it. So we're gonna start with 1 cup of powdered sugar. I'm gonna add that in here. I'm going to go grab some milk out of my fridge, and we're going to add a couple tablespoons of milk to this. So the recipe calls for between 2 to 3 tablespoons of milk or heavy cream. We're going to use whole milk. I'm going to start with 2 tablespoons, and we're going to see if that is the right amount. So let's add that in there. We're also going to need a little more of our homemade vanilla extract. So we're going to need half a teaspoon. I've got a 1/4 teaspoon here, so I'm just going to fill this up twice. Now, if you want this to be flavored icing, you could definitely use lemon extract, orange extract. Some other kind of extract would be really delicious in here too. Almond extract would be really good. But for today, we're going simple, and we're going to go vanilla. I think lemon would probably also really be delicious with these blueberry scones. But we're just going to go simple and classic. So we just want to mix this up. You can see, because I was using homemade vanilla, it's extra rich and extra dark, and this frosting almost looks a little bit brown. If you're using store-bought vanilla, you may get that a little bit, probably not quite as much. Now here's where you want to look at the consistency of your icing. If it's not thick enough, you want to add a little more sugar. If it's too thick, you add a little more milk. I think this is about how we want it, so I'm going to let it sit like this. You also want to taste it, and if it's a little bit too sweet for your taste, you want to add a little pinch of salt. So I'm going to go ahead and taste this and see how it is. So we're going to leave it just like this. We're going to let our scones cool for probably a couple more minutes. I'm going to go ahead and put them on a cooling rack, and then we're just going to drizzle a little bit of icing over the top of them. Then we're going to let them cool completely, and we're going to enjoy them tonight after dinner. These would also make a great breakfast if you're feeling a little decadent. They make kind of a decadent breakfast, especially when you add the icing. But for a special occasion, that could be a great option. Brunch is a great option too, or just any kind of snack or dessert. We're using ours for dessert. So I'll meet you back here when they're cooled off enough to ice. All done and iced, and they look beautiful. So these are going to be our dessert after dinner tonight, but I was thinking it's not really right to let you guys go without letting you know how it is. So I think it's only right that I take a little sample and let you know. So let's try a little bite. These are really good. They're nice and crumbly. They have just the right amount of sweetness, not too much. They have a good texture, just a little bit crunchy on the edges and nice and soft in the middle still. So this is an excellent recipe. I'm going to link it below, and I definitely recommend that you give it a try. I hope you're having a great day, and I hope to see you again soon. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.